Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first body turned up before sunrise, floating against one of the bridge supports of the Mississippi River. A tugboat crew spotted it and radioed police. When the rescue team hauled the remains ashore, the water poured out in reddish streams against the concrete. Her throat was cut clean, from ear to ear, and a zip tie hung still tight around one wrist. St. Louis had seen murders plenty, but this one looked practiced. Detective Eli Moran had been on the job 15 years, long enough to know a show when he saw one. The killer wanted it seen. The placement near the bridge, the careful slice of the wound, the wrists bound front, not back. It felt like a message, though none of them knew what it meant. The victim was Tara Bell, 22, a waitress at a riverfront bar. She left after a late shift 2 nights earlier, wearing the same black shirt they found her in. No robbery, no assault, just precision. The crime lab said the cut came from an industrial blade, the kind used for meat processing. Detectives checked every slaughterhouse and packaging plant in the metro area. Dozens used those knives. Within a week, evidence stacks filled a dozen folders, and the city already whispered about another butcher, like St. Louis had in the old headlines. Eli hated the nickname, but it stuck. Then they found number 2. A jogger discovered her 7 days later, about 3 miles upriver. The method was identical. Same wrist tie, same cut. Fibers from a dark jacket clung to her shirt, and a footprint in the mud matched a work boot size 11.5. The boot print carried an uneven tread, the mark of someone limping. At headquarters, the overtime lights burned all night. They traced shoe sales, checked parolees, and eventually came across a name that felt solid. Jack Luton, a 40-year-old plant worker at a meatpacking facility in East St. Louis. He'd been suspended for absenteeism 2 months earlier after co-workers complained of strange habits, wandering the floor after hours, keeping blades sharpened even when not scheduled. When officers first visited his house, nobody answered. Out front, a white van sat in weeds. Inside, they found ropes, duct tape, and stains across the plywood floor. Forensics found trace blood. Animal mostly, but 2 drops human. Still, it wasn't enough to charge him. Eli sat in his car afterward, looking at the river lights reflecting off the damp road. 2 dead girls. Same killer. He felt sure. He just couldn't prove it yet. He watched the vans from the meat plants roll past every night, and thought how easy it would be to hide a 3rd victim in one. 3 weeks later, someone called 911 from the levee near Chain of Rocks Bridge. Another body, this one arranged upright against a piling, eyes open, wrists tied tighter this time. There was something new. Crimson spray paint across her bare shoulder, a crude letter R. The killer wanted to be named. At the morgue, Eli studied the line of the wound again. Clean, efficient, always the same depth, almost mechanical. He asked the tech whether a boning knife could leave edges like that. The tech said yes, and that it required strength and practice to do it so evenly. Every slaughterhouse supervisor in town knew Jack Luton's name by then. His personnel file showed he'd lost a finger years back in a factory accident. It explained the limp, too. Nerve damage from the same incident. The pattern fit perfectly. What didn't fit were the night surveillance placed him asleep in his trailer 30 miles out of town during the murders. Eli didn't trust coincidences. He visited the plant after hours and walked through the rows of hanging carcasses and clattering hooks. The smell was metallic and heavy. He asked the night foreman if anyone else ever came in late. The man hesitated, then said, Sometimes, the cleanup guys. There's one that keeps to himself. Big fellow. Foot drags. The name was Cal Jonas, another ex-employee and longtime friend of Luton's. He had worked sanitation until being fired for threatening a foreman. Jonas served time before for assault, knife use included. Records showed he sometimes stayed at Luton's trailer. Sometimes borrowed his van too. By late August, the department knew they had 2 violent men and 1 deadly routine. Luton sharpened blades for sport. Jonas knew how to use them. The question became who was leading who. That weekend, another woman went missing after walking home from a bar in Soulard. Police flooded the area. The next day, fishermen near the bridge noticed gulls circling low over the water. They found what was left of her half buried in driftwood. Same cut throat, same wrist binds, this time with red paint scrawled across her chest. 3. Eli's blood went cold. The killer was counting them now. That afternoon, technicians back at the lab called with fresh results. Those 2 faint drops of human blood in Luton's van, they matched Tara Bell, the first victim. The warrant went out at once. The raid on Luton's trailer took place under thunderclouds. Police busted the door open to find the man inside, sitting motionless beside the table, meat knives laid out like trophies. On the wall behind him, photos tagged from newspapers, each victim, each river site circled with marker. Luton said nothing as they cuffed him. On his workbench, officers found another knife, edge polished to mirror brightness, with fresh river silt still clinging near the hilt. Beneath it, another scrap of red paint. When they turned the house over, they found Cal Jonas buried shallow behind the shed, throat cut the same way. The knife in him, one used at slaughterhouses, had prints belonging to Luton alone. They found camera film later in the trailer freezer, each roll stamped with numbers counting up to 3. Every photo showed the same. They were trophies of the victims, shot before being dumped. The killing stopped that fall. Under fluorescent courtroom lights months later, Luton said he started the murders as discipline. His tone, calm, almost polite. Said he began with animals, moved to the careless ones. The quiet of the river made him feel invisible. He'd barely fought sentencing. Missouri charged him with 3 confirmed murders, and after conviction, he went to death row without appeal. Eli attended the execution years later. He didn't regret it, but he also didn't feel better. Monsters kept coming. Luton was just the one whose trail he followed long enough to close. The river drifted on, slow and indifferent, carrying with it the same silt that had once hidden every wound. 3 years after Jack Luton was executed by lethal injection, the river gave up another body. The same spot. The same cut. The same wrists, bound tight. Detective Eli Moran had sworn he was done with that part of his life. He worked missing persons now, quieter cases, families, not blood. But when the call came about the body under the bridge, his captain insisted. "It looks like one of yours," she said, voice flat. He drove down before dawn, headlights catching the mist over the water. The recovery team worked under portable floods that turned the fog into a pale wall. The victim was a woman in her 30s, no ID, just that same faint groove on the neck. Duct tape fibers on her wrists. 2 red paint streaks, shaped like the number 4. Eli stared a long time. The press would eat this alive. Luton was dead, case closed, everyone satisfied. The new scene felt like history clawing its way back out of the water. The coroner confirmed details the next day. The blade was the same type, industrial boning knife. And the paint, cheap enamel, brush applied while wet. No one kept that kind of mark unless they wanted to repeat the first monster's work. The city called it a copycat, but something in the precision bothered him. Luton had turned chaos into habit. Whoever did this wasn't sloppy either. They didn't copy him for fame. They copied him because they believed in his pattern. Then there was the second. 2 weeks later. A younger victim this time, 22, same wounds, same tied wrists, painted 5 across her ribs. Every time they found one, someone had taken the detail further, posed, numbered, placed exactly where old sites sat downstream. Eli reopened everything. He spread the old files across his apartment. Photos, maps, path charts of current. The old spots formed a curve that followed flood runoff routes. When he added the new sites, the line continued exactly. Whoever this was had studied the evidence archives, or worse, learned from someone inside the department. Investigators focused on Cal Jonas's old circle, those who had worked alongside Luton at the meat plants. Many still lived across the river in Illinois. One name recurred on shift logs from the time just before Luton's capture, Wesley Rudd. Rudd, 39, had been a night cleaner and part-time butcher. His address led to a rusted mobile home near Madison's Edge. When Eli and his partner drove out, they found Rudd at the table sharpening a blade identical to the one from the crime lab display photo. He didn't resist arrest, just stared ahead as they cuffed him. "I knew you'd come," he said, voice dull, tired. Inside his freezer were 3 rolls of undeveloped film. One showed photographs of the first new victim, alive, sitting on the ground, bound by her wrists. Rudd had written the numbers 4, 5, and 6 on each package. Under interrogation, he said Luton was his teacher. They'd met years earlier during a stint at the plant. "He told me work was only practice," Rudd said, smiling faintly. "Said the knife can teach patience." The files confirmed it. Luton had indeed trained him briefly, before his injury forced early retirement. But Rudd went further. He said there were others. "Jack didn't pass me everything," he told them. He said the river would carry the rest. Psych profiling tried to read him as delusional, but the photos proved otherwise. Rudd knew details that no papers printed. The exact placement of wrist ties, the brand of duct tape, even the angle of every blade. He claimed the numbers meant order, that each killing followed a rule, the same one Luton wrote in his notebook police found long ago, a list of phrases about the clean line, discipline, and completing the set. Detectives searched Rudd's trailer again, looking for evidence of more victims. What they found instead caused new panic. A binder containing yellowed newspaper clippings about the original murders, alongside a photocopy of police sketches labeled 7 to 10. The next targets had already been plotted onto highway mile markers. City authorities doubled patrols along the river. Late October rain turned everything slick and uneasy. 1 week later, joggers spotted a half-buried shoe on the bank, just north of downtown. Investigators found the rest of a woman beneath it, again numbered. Rudd sat in jail through it all, no chance of having done it himself. Whoever committed the latest killing had access to the same information he did. Eli returned to old coworkers, questioned everyone who could have seen archived evidence, clerks, interns, even photographers. The same one kept surfacing, a young forensic tech named Mark Dade, who had cataloged the crime scene photographs both from Luton and from Rudd's cases before leaving the department a year earlier. Dade had vanished since quitting. His apartment keys were left behind. Inside his place, police found red paint cans, rope, and a chemical-stained tarp. On the kitchen table, small Polaroids just being developed, 2 that showed unfamiliar women, alive but bound, looking terrified, and a white scrap of paper marked 7. He'd gone underground. The next phase was waiting. When the next storm hit that November, patrol boats found torn fragments of duct tape floating downstream at 3 different points. The pattern formed an arc toward the floodgate compound, an old industrial pump station long abandoned. SWAT entered at dawn. Inside, the air reeked of mold and iron. They found Mark Dade kneeling beside what he called his work table. The remnants of red paint stained his hands. A half-dead camera flash sat beside an unfinished Polaroid. He was working on another victim, this one alive but barely conscious, caught before it was too late. He didn't fight when police hauled him away. "It's not done," he said calmly. "The river hasn't gone quiet yet." Dade confessed later to 3 killings, numbers 4 through 6, and attempted a 4th. Prosecutors confirmed the evidence. He said he'd studied Luton's case for months, obsessing over precision and ritual. What haunted Eli most, though, was Dade's explanation of what drove him. "Jack was never alone," Dade said. "He built something. He called it the line. Every one of us keeps it moving." The executions, Eli thought, never closed anything. They just sank another lesson into the dark. After court, the detective stood once more beside the bridge where it all began. The water moved smooth and silent, as though pretending nothing had ever broken its surface. He knew better, because when police searched Dade's evidence boxes later, buried beneath the rest, they found a final photograph, an empty riverside stretch marked only by red paint spelling 11. The next number waited. The winter after Mark Dade's conviction should have been quiet. He was locked away for 3 life sentences, no chance of parole, and the river froze thick enough that even the tugboat slowed. But the quiet didn't last. In early February, a homeless man scavenging near the Riverwalk called police about a duffel bag snagged on driftwood. Inside were blood-soaked work gloves, a length of zip tie, and a folded Polaroid, the kind from the old killings. Written along its bottom edge in shaky red letters was one word: again. An hour later, a new body floated into view half a mile downstream. The cut was cleaner than ever. Same wrist ties, same brushstroke of paint. The number 11 glared across the shoulder. Detective Eli Moran had retired 6 months before, but the call came to his house anyway. He didn't need to hear more. He put on his coat and met the crime scene units before dawn, standing silent as flashlights cut through mist. Everyone agreed. It was the same ritual, but whoever did it was changing details. The red paint was sprayed instead of brushed. The ligature scars looked older, the cut deeper. The killer wasn't copying anymore. He was improving. Eli traced every name tied to the line. Dade was locked up. Rudd was dead, beaten in prison. Luton had been executed years earlier, but Dade had written a list during confession. Minor interns, plant workers, correspondents from odd message boards, he said, shared his obsession. They wanted to learn. He'd told investigators. They called themselves Watchers. Moran went through those names one by one. Most were kids who'd visited online forums about criminal pathology. Nothing serious. One stood out. Dana Keller, 26, a forensic photography student who had written directly to Dade from her university email during his trial, posing as a journalist. She'd moved to St. Louis shortly after his conviction, then dropped out of school. Eli visited her listed address, a basement apartment near the old train yards. It was bare, except for a folding table covered in photo gear, rope coils, and a drying line strung with Polaroids of riverside scenes. Most were empty landscapes. One wasn't. It showed a man's hands gripping a knife handle, shot from above. Behind the table sat a small silver case. Inside were vinyl gloves and a dictation recorder. When he pressed play, a quiet voice, a woman's, spoke calmly. "Test 11. Water level has dropped. blade motion steady, marking applied. It wasn't a diary, it was a field note. Evidence teams swarmed the apartment, but Keller was gone. Her car plate registered twice on highway cameras over the next 24 hours heading toward Illinois. Then it vanished. On the third night, dispatch radioed a call from East St. Louis road crews. One of their graders had struck something buried near a levee access road. Wood, wrapped tight in tarp. The body was fresh, same red paint. Number 12 carved instead of written. Keller's prints were on the tape. Eli rejoined the case full-time even though nobody asked. He retraced her escape route, mapping where she could have hidden. The line of murder stretched north to south along the Mississippi's edge, looping like a scar. By spacing, the next likely dump site was near the old grain silos on Watson Bend, an industrial patch long abandoned. They found her there 4 days later. A police drone first spotted the van, white, parked crooked by the fence. Keller sat inside, head resting on the steering wheel. She wasn't dead. She'd cut herself shallowly across the wrist, but passed out before finishing. In the passenger seat lay her camera and several developed Polaroids of Eli himself parked across from the station days earlier. She had been watching him. At headquarters she talked little, alternating between tremors of fear and calm rehearsed lines about continuing the line. She said Luton's work was exact, Dade's weak, and her own finished with precision. She named the victims not as people but as measurements. Investigators pinned her squarely for the most recent killings, but Keller only smiled during questioning. When shown the Polaroid labeled 11, she shook her head. "That wasn't mine," she said. "That was proof." "Proof of what?" someone asked. She didn't answer, only whispered, "There are 13 marks on the river." Teams searched for days after her arrest and found nothing new until a flood receded near an old access tunnel below the grain silos. Lodged in the silt was another sealed bag. Inside was a camera identical to hers, its flash cracked. The last photo inside the cartridge showed Eli Moran standing by the river, his flashlight beam cutting across water. He had never seen anyone take it. Memory cards later confirmed timestamps coinciding with Keller's arrest. Someone else had been there, photographing both the river and Eli himself. Publicly, police called the 12th killing the end. Keller took her plea deal and vanished behind high walls. The press lost interest. But Eli kept checking the waterline. Months rolled to autumn. He waited for winter storms to cleanse away everything that still shimmered red beneath. One night in November, he found another sign, paint, faded but visible, sprayed across a drainage wall, 13. The number marked the last open space on Dade's old sketches, an unfinished circle at the city's southern bend. When Eli shone his flashlight down the crumbling path, he saw the outline of a human figure half submerged, face up, water sucking at the edges. Backup arrived minutes later. Crime scene confirmed. The body was unrecognizable, left long enough to rot, but still bound the same as the others. On the shoulder, red paint formed not a number but a word, end. DNA testing would later show the victim was an ex-prison guard from the facility where Luton died. The circle had closed exactly where it started, within sight of the bridge where Tara Bell had been found 4 years earlier. After the 15th hour on scene, Moran walked away from the floodlights and looked back at the river, wondering whether the end was really the end or another invitation to begin. When the wind shifted, he thought he heard water hitting the pylons like footsteps fading away. He told himself it was just current, but deep down, he knew the river never stayed silent for long. By spring, the river swelled past its edges again, brown water folding over the same banks that had hidden a decade of violence. The official report claimed the line murders had stopped with Dana Keller's imprisonment. The word "Eend" painted on the last body gave the city exactly what it wanted. Something finished. But Detective Eli Moran couldn't believe it. He still received letters every few months, unsigned, always postmarked from towns along the Mississippi. Each note contained an undeveloped Polaroid and a single message written in red pen. The newest one, marked March 12th, carried just 4 words. 13 was not enough. When the film was developed, the picture showed the front steps of his own police precinct. Eli handed it to evidence but kept the original envelope, studying the handwriting by lamplight. The pen pressure matched Luton's old prison forms. The way the letters leaned slightly to the right, identical. But Luton had been cremated after his execution. Someone was copying more than technique now. They were copying signature. In April, another woman disappeared, a delivery driver last seen at the warehouses near the grain silos. The site lay inside the same cluster Keller used as dump grounds. Search teams found her within 24 hours, half buried in silt, red paint drawn across the collarbone, 14. Everything repeated, the ropes, the precision, the professional blade cut. But the body placement had changed. She faced west, toward the water, not north, toward the bridge. When the coroner turned her over, there was something underneath, a laminated file photo of Keller herself, trimmed at the edges as if torn from an evidence board. Eli stared at it, knowing what it meant. This copycat wasn't worshiping the killers. They were mocking the investigation. Whoever they were, they wanted him to follow. He stopped sleeping. He spent his nights driving stretches of Levee Road, stopping at every old site like a ghost, retracing his own steps. At one bend, he noticed a pattern. Each murder spaced roughly 11 miles from the last, all part of a curve that, if continued, would drag the line straight through downtown. A perfect circle, one that would close near the courthouse steps. 3 nights later, he received another envelope. No note this time. Just sand, and a map torn from a street directory, a red X drawn over the words Jefferson Industrial Yards. The precinct set up surveillance immediately. The site was huge. Warehouses, parked trucks, broken silos that echoed with the river wind. Search teams swept in daylight and found nothing. At dusk, Eli went back alone, carrying only his flashlight and sidearm. He told himself he wasn't chasing ghosts, but deep down he already knew the routine. These killers worked in patterns, and he'd been part of it since the day he'd found Tara Bell's body under the bridge. The smell hit first, metallic and thick. When his light swung across the floor of a gutted hangar, it illuminated streaks of red dragging toward a tarp-covered shape. Underneath lay another body. This one posed differently, the right hand clutching a Polaroid camera. The photo in the slot was still developing. Eli held his breath and waited for the image to clear. When it did, he saw himself standing in the hangar doorway, flashlight raised, exactly as he stood now. He spun toward the rear wall and saw movement, a figure slipping through the side door. He gave chase across gravel and mud, gun raised, shouting into wind. The person ducked into the brush, leading back toward the river, and vanished. All that remained of the water's edge was a second Polaroid, fluttering, wet in the grass. The picture showed the bridge where the first victim had been found 5 years earlier, a red circle drawn around one support column. Beneath it, written in marker, 15 closes the water. The city went on alert. Patrol boats swept the river every night. Divers checked each radius of the map, finding nothing until early May, when the current shifted after a storm. Wedged behind the circled bridge support was a concrete cylinder arranged neatly beside a weighted tarp. Inside, encased in plastic, was the 15th body, a man this time. DNA confirmed his identity within the hour. Officer Raymond Glynn, a former investigator removed from the Sandpit Task Force years earlier for misconduct. The cycle hadn't been random. The new killer was purging everyone who had touched the old cases. Keller, Rudd. Even Eli's own name sat next in the archive list. That realization burned through him. If 15 was supposed to close the water, then 16 would likely close the line, end the circle, with him. He didn't run. He waited. Every night through May, he walked the riverfront, between the bridge and the silos. Some part of him wanted the confrontation, the thing that would finish what had started. The postman delivered one more envelope mid-month. Inside, a piece of Polaroid film split down the middle. On one half, a picture of Eli himself leaning over a crime scene. On the other, the reflection of a figure holding a knife behind the camera. The photograph smelled of river mud. 2 days later, storms rolled over St. Louis again. Lightning lit the span of the bridge where it all began. When emergency crews arrived before dawn, they found a burnt-out sedan abandoned at the edge of the levee. On the front seat was a final Polaroid, perfectly dry despite the rain. It showed nothing but dark water, smooth, empty. Across the bottom, one word written in trembling print: 0. Eli Moran was never seen again. Divers searched weeks, dragging the depths, finding no trace. Some said he jumped. Others whispered that whoever finished the killings finally buried the detective within the current itself. Officially, the line murders ended at 15. But every year on the week of his disappearance, someone mails a Polaroid to the police precinct. It's always blank water, the same view of the river, the same single word scrawled across the border. Again. Now let's begin the next story for tonight. It started in the heat, one of those midsummer weeks when the air itself felt baked. The first victim was found in a public gym west of downtown, slumped against the shower wall. Her name was Jackie Sanborn, 29, a fitness instructor who usually opened the place alone at 5 in the morning. Police found her keys still hanging in the front door. Inside, everything was clean except the locker room floor, where a faint outline of blood ran toward the drains. She'd been hit twice on the head, then strangled with a white shoelace torn from her own sneakers. No sign of forced entry. Whoever killed her had known the building's keypad code. Detective Renee Vega caught the call at sunrise. She was new to homicide but had grown up in Phoenix, tough and straightforward, the kind who didn't waste time on theories until she had something solid in front of her. Jackie's body provided plenty: bruised knuckles, broken thumbnail, defensive struggle, but no DNA under her nails. Security cameras in the hallway had been turned off manually. The footage ended the night before at 9:38 p.m., just after closing. Vega found one smudged fingerprint on the switch, not enough for a match. For the rest of July, she and her partner hit a wall. Then, another body turned up. This time it was across town, a different gym, same layout. The cleaner found the victim lying face up in front of a row of lockers, eyes covered with a towel. Her name was Brenda Ellis, mid-30s, freelance personal trainer. Same shoelace strangulation. Same camera wires unplugged. People started calling it the locker room killer, a name Vega hated but couldn't shake. The similarities made headlines. Both victims, young, athletic, found inside gyms at night, same weapon, same eerie quiet. Background checks showed both women had accounts with a mobile app called FitMate, a popular tracker used by gym clients and independent trainers to schedule one-on-one sessions. The app stored meetup details and contact messages. Brenda and Jackie had both exchanged private messages with the same user, Iron Joe 97. The account turned out fake, registered with a prepaid phone, no real ID attached, but GPS tags showed it had pinged from the same cell tower cluster north of the downtown freeway both nights of the murders. That section of town wasn't much. A few strip malls, a laundromat, a small bodybuilding gym open 24 hours. Vega decided to go there herself one evening. Inside were maybe 6 people lifting weights under buzzing fluorescent lights. Posters of contests lined the walls. The manager, a nervous man named Rick Acevedo, said he recognized both victims. They had been guest trainers months back for a local fitness event. Rick looked like he hadn't slept in days. Vega asked if anyone went by. "Joe." His eyes flicked toward the back hall. "Maybe," he muttered. Behind the locker door stood a tall man with bleach-white earbuds in, wrapping tape around his hands. His name tag read Joseph Sachs. He was calm, too calm, meeting her questions with steady eyes and precise answers. He'd never used FitMate, he said. Didn't know the victims personally, but his phone sat charging right beside his bag. A cheap throwaway model with all serials filed off. Vega's instincts flared. She sent the number for analysis. Within 2 days, the lab confirmed it had once carried SIM data linking back to the Iron Joe 97 FitMate account. The same night the warrant came through, another call hit dispatch, body number 3. This time the scene was a smaller private fitness center near Camelback Road. Victim, Tasha Morales, gym manager. Her body lay across the bench press, throat marked by one more shoelace. The cameras showed footage for once. A blurry frame captured at 9:41 p.m., a figure pulling his hood low, stepping through the door. Vega froze the image on screen while forensics processed it. Slight limp on the left leg. Same height, same build, same rough outline as Joseph Sachs. He confessed less than 12 hours later. Not with tears, not with anger, just cold resignation. He said the women had all ignored him when he tried to, quote, train properly. Claimed they broke gym rules, disrespected the order. When asked how he chose them, he said, they were the loud ones. The shoelaces were trophies, each pair from the gym where he'd met them. He'd kept the knots he used to strangle them identical every time, logging details in a notebook filled with times, heart rates, and weight stats, as if recording workouts instead of murders. Sachs's capture brought relief, but not peace. Reporters called Vega the lucky one who stopped the locker room killer, yet something about the confession unsettled her. He spoke of discipline, precision, counting seconds between each breath, like a routine practice to perfection. When the case closed, she returned his locker key to evidence and noticed something overlooked. A second key on the same chain, smaller, unmarked. It fit none of the gym's locks. When she ran its cut pattern later, maintenance said it matched an older storage unit from another complex 3 blocks away. One abandoned after back rent went unpaid. Vega went alone. Inside the unit stood nothing but a workout bench, a cheap tripod, and a stack of labeled USB drives, each marked with dates going back a full year before Jackie Sanborn's death. The drives contained videos, all recorded late at night, inside gyms across the city. Most showed nothing, machines, mirrors, shadows, but some captured women during closing hours, unaware they were being filmed. One video showed a figure moving behind the camera while loading new memory sticks. He wasn't Joseph Sachs. Different build entirely, shorter, wearing gloves. When Vega slowed the footage, she saw him wave toward the lens, mouthing something before the screen cut to black. With no sound, she had to guess by the shape of his lips. It looked a lot like he said, "Keep score." Forensic timestamps dated that footage to 2 months after Sachs's arrest, meaning someone else still had the keys. By spring, the news had gone quiet. Everyone believed Joseph Sachs was the only killer. He sat in a state cell outside Tucson, spending his mornings walking circles in a yard. But Detective Renee Vega couldn't let it go. The footage from that storage unit still burned in her thoughts. The gloved figure mouthing, "Keep score." 2 months after Sachs's sentencing, another death hit the feeds. A gym member was found strangled with a shoelace at a facility on the far northeast side of town. The victim this time was a man, and that would have been enough for police to call it coincidence, except for the details. Unplugged security cameras, single clean hit to the temple, same looped white lace, and the towel draped over the eyes. Vega drove out before the body was even cold. The gym sat in a plaza surrounded by neon tanning salons and night takeout shops. She stood inside the locker room, the air heavy with chlorine and cheap detergent, and saw it immediately. Precision. No frantic violence, no wasted motion. Whoever did it had studied Sachs's method in detail. The prints gave nearly nothing. One partial thumb smudge on duct tape that matched a training employee named Trey Donovan. He was 25, new to the gym, and a part-time personal trainer. His story was thin. He'd closed up early and claimed someone else must have slipped in later. But when Vega checked his background, she found he'd worked at another gym across town the previous year under a different name, one linked to the billing system from the same 24-hour complex where Sachs used to train. At the precinct, Vega pulled up hours of testimony from Sachs's interviews, hoping something would click. Halfway through one tape, Sachs mentioned a partner. Not a friend, he said. A spotter. Vega had brushed over it at the time. Now it landed like impact. Spotters helped you lift. They kept count when you couldn't. She went back through the confiscated notebook from the evidence room. Every entry listed victim initials, times, and the words R1, R2, R3, sets, and reps. Next to the last entry, written faintly in pencil, was something new she'd never noticed before. TD equals fourth routine. TD Trey Donovan. Vega called for a new warrant immediately. When officers searched Trey's apartment, they found a small plastic crate beside his bed full of gym tags from different places across Arizona, each one labeled with a Sharpie number from 1 to 4. A white pair of sneakers sat beneath them, no laces. Inside his kitchen drawer, they found another USB drive identical to those from Sachs's storage unit. The footage showed Trey and Sachs working out together, each taking turns loading weights, the camera fixed on the mirror. Halfway through the video, Trey spoke clearly enough for the mic to catch it. "We help each other finish." That was all Vega needed. When the arrest team arrived at his apartment the next morning, he was gone. Surveillance picked him up at a convenience store on the highway heading south. There, he bought rope, food, and 2 gallons of water before disappearing into the desert. For weeks, nothing. Then the city hit June heat, and another killing dropped into her lap. A young woman, this time discovered behind an outdoor training park west of Mesa, strangled with a shoelace and draped with a gym towel. On her shoulder, red permanent marker spelled 5. That was how Trey labeled his sets, counting upward. Search teams combed the valley and found her car parked by a hiking trail. Inside the glove compartment, a folded note waited, scrawled messily. One more representative for Joe. When Sachs prison guards read the report aloud to him, he laughed for the first time in months. "Told you we practiced together," he said. Vega spent every night that summer chasing calls across the burning outskirts of Phoenix, abandoned strip malls, trailheads, fitness yards. During one search, a new tip came from a woman who ran a late-night yoga studio downtown. She said a man matching Trey's picture had been renting her extra room for weeks using cash, and that he left every night between midnight and 2 a.m. They raided that studio before dawn. Inside the small back room, they found a line of portable gym equipment, the same brand Sachs used for training videos, and a whiteboard filled with numbered diagrams. stick figures, arrows, circles drawn around heads, and columns marked time, breath, pressure. At the top of the board, in large red letters, were the words "Final Form." A door off the back of the studio opened into an alley. Trey lay there, dead by his own hand, a shoelace knotted around his neck like a metal ribbon. Inside his pocket was a card folded once. "We finished 6. Keep it clean." It was signed J.S. Vega, read the initials 3 times. Joseph Sachs. Her hands went cold. There was no way he had sent it from prison, yet handwriting analysis confirmed the signature matched exactly. Either Sachs had written those cards long before his arrest, or someone still inside was passing along his orders. Vega drove to the state penitentiary herself. Sachs was waiting in a white visitation room, smiling wider than before. When she laid the card in front of him, he tilted his head slowly. "I always said routines spread," he whispered. "It's not just mine anymore." That night, Vega wrote her report but didn't file it immediately, because as she typed, she could swear she heard something scraping faintly under her desk, a small plastic rolling across tile. When she looked down, there it was, a single white shoelace, tied into a loose knot, perfectly clean. The desert heat that year barely dropped at night, and the city smelled of dust and gasoline. Detective Renee Vega lived in that heat now, the kind that made her wake sweating, expecting another phone call about another body. 6 months had passed since Trey Donovan's suicide, and the case was supposed to be over. The public believed the killings were confined to one obsessive trainer and his, quote, mentor, Joseph Sachs, locked away in a remote state prison. But in the first week of June, 3 homicides hit Phoenix in a single weekend. All the victims worked in fitness: a nutritionist, a treadmill supplier, and a front desk clerk at a 24-hour franchise. Each body was found in a different part of the city. Yet every scene looked like it came from the same dark template: shoelace knots tied with military precision, towels draped over faces, clocks in their buildings unplugged and set to 0-100. Whoever did it was keeping time exactly the way Sachs had. Vega sat through autopsy photos until her eyes hurt. The same marks, same looped ligature. But one minor difference caught her attention: a faint burn on each victim's wrist that looked like the impression of a plastic watch band. The lab later discovered traces of melted rubber and metal fit tracker parts. Someone had recorded their pulse during the killings. She remembered Sachs's phrase from his first interrogation: "The heart rate sets the rhythm." Vega requested Sachs be moved to a high-security interview wing. He had grown thinner, hair shaved close, calm as ever. "They're finishing the routine for me," he said quietly. "The reps belong to everyone now." "What are you talking about?" she asked. "The network," he said. "We built it in training. You can't stop practice once it starts." He refused to give names. Instead, he recited a list of zip codes, the same zones where the new victims lived. When Vega checked, each address matched a gym run by a franchise called Train Hard Plus, a budget chain that recruited employees through online forums dedicated to private fitness tracking. Those forums had been Sachs's digital playground years earlier. Working with cybercrime, her team dug into server records. They uncovered a small private message group hidden inside one trainer forum. 10 active users traded coded posts about routines and form work. One username, CleanForm13, logged in at 3 a.m. from a computer inside the same prison that held Sachs. He wasn't alone back there. The state warden admitted that inmates in the rehabilitation program had short internet sessions for classwork. Sachs had supervised those labs. Vega felt her stomach drop. He had built a following inside, teaching others how to continue his ritual once released. 2 inmates from that program had finished their sentences right before the new killing started: Marco Darnell and Keegan Krull. She started with Krull, who lived across town working maintenance at a small warehouse. When detectives arrived, the place was empty, but smelled of bleach. In a locked closet, they found another set of numbered USB drives and a row of watches running on synced timers. The first drive contained video of the most recent victim, recorded like a workout tape, calm narration detailing breathing intervals, each section labeled Set 7. Vega knew immediately there would be more. Just after midnight, dispatch called in another body west of the river, the towel and lace pattern identical once again. On the mirror beside her was red marker writing, 8/8, complete, reset. The meaning clicked later that morning. 8 murders, 8 repetitions, and reset meant start again. Vega called the prison warden and arranged an emergency raid of the rehab lab. The computers, external drives were gone, their cases wiped clean with industrial solvent. Sachs sat in his cell reading an old fitness manual. When she confronted him, he only said, "You train 1, they train 2, that's progression." It was smug and terrifying because he was telling the truth. Copying multiplied faster than she could trace. Within a week, the killings stopped as suddenly as they began. No notes, no messages, nothing. It looked over, but Vega didn't believe gaps meant peace. She spent nights cataloging shoe brands, fitness apps, employee rosters. When fatigue hit, she'd dream of hearing shoelaces snapping tight somewhere close by. Then, at the start of August, a padded envelope landed on her desk with no return address. Inside were 4 brand new gym membership tags attached to their lanyards, each printed with her own badge number instead of a name. On the back of one tag, someone had written in perfect block letters, "Warm-up complete." The fingerprints on the envelope matched no record in state databases. That night, Vega drove to the empty gym where the original murders began. She found a red spray paint mark on the side wall, 2 stacked rectangles like a pause button. Right then, she realized the killings weren't random violence at all. They were training exercises, paused until someone decided to start again. The thought sank in heavy. Every disciple Sachs had touched, inside or out, now knew the routine by heart. All they needed was permission to continue. And from the look of that red symbol on the wall, they were only waiting for the next countdown to hit play. The first message came through the sheriff's dispatch line, short and flat, a pre-recorded voice saying only, "Begin." That was how Detective Renee Vega knew the pause was over. 4 murders followed in 9 days. Same method, same clean timing. There were no clear fingerprints, no skipped beats. The killers weren't amateurs, they were coordinated. Vega understood then that the network didn't exist as individuals anymore. It functioned like a circuit, different bodies carrying the same pulse. Each scene pointed toward one location, downtown Phoenix, a newly opened high-end fitness center called Axis Strength, built on the bones of an old gym, the one where Joseph Sachs first trained. When Vega walked through its bright glass doors, déjà vu hit her hard. The locker layout was identical to the original murder site, right down to mirror placement. The owner on paper was Lucas Darnell, brother of former inmate Marco Darnell. Vega and her team installed discreet surveillance cameras around the facility while they gathered enough evidence for a full warrant. What they didn't expect was for the network to come to them first. One night, the gym lights flicked on remotely by staff who weren't there. Music started playing over the sound system, a rehearsal track used for timed workouts. When police stormed in, they found every locker door open. Inside each, a single white shoelace coiled neatly into a figure 8. A new pattern. Infinity. Never ending. It wasn't a message anymore. It was a threat. She knew there was only one person capable of orchestrating this from behind bars. Vega pushed the paperwork for a permanent transfer of Sachs to a federal unit with no communication privileges. The approval took a week, and before the move could happen, officers found him hanging from his cell window, a strip of his sheet twisted the same way as those laces. Under the bunk, he'd carved one phrase into the concrete: "Form completed." Forensics proved what she'd feared. Sachs couldn't have tied that knot himself. The angle was wrong. Someone else had been in the cell, likely one of the new correctional fitness trainers hired through the same company that owned Axis Strength. The circle was eating itself. Vega planned her own version of a workout, reverse engineering the routine. If the killers moved in sets of time and distance, she would schedule one in return. She released a false statement to the press that police had decoded the network's communications, hinting at an imminent mass arrest. Within 24 hours, the message board hidden inside the gym tracking app lit up with frantic posts. The plan worked. One user, CleanForm13, the same handle from years earlier, typed a single phrase: "Final set, West Flood Channel, midnight." She went alone. Body armor, radio silent, flashlight off. When she reached the flood control channel, the concrete slope shimmered under security lights. 9 figures waited in matching gym gear, each wearing a fitness tracker pulsing red. They didn't charge her. They didn't speak. One man stepped forward. "Marco Darnell, you came to finish it," he said quietly. Vega raised her gun. "It ends now." He shook his head and pointed at the line of followers behind him. "You can't end a routine. You can only reach failure." Then the trackers on their wrists began beeping in unison, rhythmic, like a metronome. She understood then that they weren't waiting for her. They were timing themselves. Every 8 seconds, each was programmed to tighten the lace tied around their forearm. Demonstration through pain, a ritual of control. Vega shouted for them to stop. When they didn't, she fired a warning shot. The ricochet scattered dust, and the spell broke. Several bolted, others froze. Backup units arrived within minutes. By dawn, 4 were dead, 2 from gunfire, 2 by their own hands. The rest were brought in half-conscious, babbling about Sachs, about the burn, about finishing what he'd taught. Phoenix finally saw the arrests it needed for closure. Reporters called Vega's act a trap that saved dozens. The department issued commendations, but in her personal report, she wrote the part no one printed. They didn't look afraid. They looked satisfied. Months passed without another body. Axis Strength shut down. The prison replaced its rehabilitation staff. Sachs and his disciples faded from public memory. Then one morning near her retirement date, Vega opened her locker at headquarters and found a small black fit tracker inside, display blinking faintly. On it, a pulse counter scrolled upward from 0. It climbed once every second until it reached 8, then reset to 0, 8 reps. She sealed it in an evidence bag, but couldn't bring herself to turn it in. Some patterns, she realized, didn't die. They rested, waiting for someone else to pick up the rhythm again. Whenever she passed a gym window and heard the hollow slap of jump ropes hitting the floor in perfect unison, she felt that same weight in her chest. Steady, timed, precise. It sounded exactly like a heartbeat, and somewhere in Phoenix, someone was already counting the next one. Now, let's start the next story. It began with a child's bicycle half buried in the sand outside an abandoned limestone quarry north of the city. The sun had not yet broken the horizon, and mist from the Indian Ocean rolled inland through scrub and eucalyptus. To the 2 rock climbers who found it, the bicycle looked like a relic from a lost camping trip. Then one of them noticed drag marks curving toward a hollow in the quarry wall, and what lay beyond turned the morning into a scene the state would talk about for years. The body was found partially covered by sand and dry leaves. Forensics determined the victim was a young woman, early 20s, with traces of duct tape still wrapped around her wrists. The examination placed death within 48 hours. The site yielded almost nothing else but tire tracks pressed into compacted gravel, leading out toward the old highway. Detective Inspector Claire Renwick, newly promoted after a decade in major crimes, was assigned to lead the case. The victim was identified as Megan Latimer, a university arts student from Subiaco, who had gone missing 3 nights earlier after leaving a house party near Leaderville. CCTV coverage in 1997 was patchy, and her last confirmed sighting came from a petrol station attendant who recalled a silver ute idling at the curb as she walked past. Renwick examined Megan's life and found little obvious corruption. She attended lectures, held a part-time job at a bookstore, and lived with 2 flatmates who described her as private, but pleasant. There was no boyfriend, no known stalker, no hint of drugs. Her diary, found under her mattress, contained no despair or turmoil, only sketches and fragments of poetic phrases, the kind that made the investigators pause because they sounded like goodbyes. By the second week, the case already strained under media attention. The headlines coined a name, the Sandpit Killing, and nightly segments speculated about serial connections despite no evidence of prior murders. The pressure attracted outsiders, volunteer search groups, psychics, opportunistic tipsters. Renwick kept her team focused on tangible leads. Tire analysis suggested a commercial-grade tread used mostly by contractors or small logistics firms. Detectives canvassed mechanics and found that a regional delivery company, West Rail Freight Services, kept several silver utility vehicles matching the description. One driver, Peter Haynes, reported his assigned vehicle stolen the night after Megan vanished. The truck was later found abandoned near the edge of Kings Park with no sign of forced entry. Clean fingerprints covered the interior, as if someone wiped it meticulously. Haynes became a person of interest only because of what investigators noticed in his service logs. 4 trips had taken him through the limestone quarries north of Perth in the last month, though his manifests listed no deliveries there. Haynes said the entries were clerical mistakes, and supervisors backed him. Still, when police searched his property, they found stacks of cut rope, work gloves, and an outdoor map with multiple pinholes aligning roughly with quarry locations. Forensics, however, returned no DNA matching Megan on any of it. Lacking evidence, the department released Haynes but stayed on him quietly. At Renwick's request, surveillance units monitored his movements across 3 weeks. He appeared ordinary, spent evenings watching television alone, mornings at work, and Sundays fishing near Fremantle Harbor. The calmness unsettled her precisely because it was too fixed, too scheduled. On the 9th of April, a second body surfaced. 2 off-road bikers stumbled upon a skeleton partially exposed in shifting sand less than 2 kilometers from the first quarry. The remains were older, consistent with a disappearance 3 years earlier. Kylie Naughton, a backpacker who had vanished while hitchhiking toward Geraldton. Her dental record confirmed identity. The similarity of the dump sites made connection undeniable. Suddenly the Sandpit case became plural. The press resurrected the term coastal killer. Renwick's office turned into Command Central. Paper maps blanketed in red markers circling every disused quarry along the Western Highway corridor. Pathologists determined Kylie's cause of death as asphyxiation using rough cloth, matching fiber traces later isolated in Megan Latimer's hair. The thread type, a gold polyester used in industrial cleaning rags, provided the first consistent link. That detail led them to a warehouse supplier serving multiple small companies, including Westrail Freight Services. Renwick obtained a new search warrant. In Haynes's storage shed, teams recovered old tarpaulins packed in salt-stained bins, bits of twine, and a cracked Polaroid frame showing nothing but a strip of desert streetlight bleeding into darkness. It felt staged, as if something had been removed. A storm rolled in the day the photo was found, flooding portions of the yard and forcing the team to suspend excavation. When they resumed 2 days later, they discovered beneath damp soil a metal pellet gun and another Polaroid fragment wedged inside its handle, a corner of cloth wrapped against what looked like rope. Forensics matched the rope fiber to the same cleaning thread composite found on the victims. That fragile link was not enough for a murder charge, but it held long enough for Renwick to request deeper record screening. She learned Haynes had once volunteered with a rural firefighting crew, dissolved after a series of misconduct claims, including unauthorized training exercises in undeveloped quarry lands. Witnesses described him bringing friends to practice night navigation across dunes, a phrase now heavy with suggestion. By early May, public hysteria deepened. Radio stations broadcast safety warnings for young women traveling alone, and newspapers ran grainy shots of police combing dunes. Despite suspicion, no confession, no blood evidence, and no witnesses tied Haynes directly to either death. It was Renwick's first brush with what felt like an invincible lie, someone doing monstrous things behind a facade of community harmlessness. Then a local geology student submitted aerial photos he had taken months earlier for a research project mapping sediment movements across the region. One image displayed the quarry site from above, time-stamped a week before Megan's disappearance. Parked alone beside the access road was a silver utility vehicle facing inland. Its markings matched Westrail's fleet. Beside the vehicle, faint tire circles formed an outline of two loops intersecting. The shape repeated again in another location along the coast, fainter but visible when contrast was enhanced. Both images marked sites where disturbed soil was later confirmed by police dogs. Excavation teams uncovered nothing that week except scattered fragments of tape and one personal item, a silver chain with a small seashell pendant embedded in hardened sand. Megan's mother identified it as her daughter's. When Renwick held the pendant in her palm that night, she realized the quarry's vast emptiness mirrored the killer's method. Each trace, deliberately distant. Each clue a quiet reflection of control. Perth had long been considered too isolated for anonymous predators, but the sandpit killings had rewritten that myth. She wrote in her report bluntly, "Whoever this offender is, he understands the geography of absence." The line stayed in the file long after she typed it, a strange choice of phrase for a police report. But among the investigators on the case, those words would soon feel more accurate than any evidence they had. Because the next discovery, the one that finally broke the story, would not come from the sand at all, but from beneath the quiet suburbs where everyone thought they were safe. Part 2. The house on Dundas Street setting, Perth, Western Australia, winter 1997. Rain carried fine sand inland that winter, coating fences and window ledges the color of bone. The dunes north of the city hardened from saturation, and police operations slowed under the weather. Still, the investigation pressed forward under the umbrella title Sandpit Task Force. Files, diagrams, aerial photographs, and soil sample reports consumed the Major Crimes Office until it looked like a geology lab more than a precinct. Detective Inspector Claire Renwick studied the expanding map each night. Each quarry where evidence turned up sat roughly along a corridor of commercial service routes, stretching from Fremantle to Yanchep. No pattern of victim selection emerged. Two women, years apart, with dissimilar backgrounds. Yet the method was unmistakable. Control by binding, asphyxiation, and staged concealment in deserted terrain. Whoever committed the crimes seemed to understand the liminal zones around Perth's urban sprawl, the places where suburb ended and wilderness resumed. Attention remained fixed on Peter Haynes, but there was never enough to hold him. He maintained his warehouse job, reported to police when required, and refused media requests with quiet politeness. Neighbors described him as punctual, meticulous, fond of gardening. Renwick had once heard a journalist call him criminally dull, a phrase that clung in her mind because dullness was often what real predators relied on. In June, the task force received a forensic report that became the case's first real opening in months. The partial Polaroid recovered from Haynes's property contained microfibers that testing linked to a specific photographic paper discontinued in 1994. Police searching public records traced remaining stock to a single camera store in East Perth. Its supplier confirmed that 1 carton of film had been sold last year in bulk to a customer named Lawrence Kerr, a name unfamiliar to investigators. The purchase slip listed an address on Dundas Street, a quiet stretch of 1970s houses near Mount Lawley, less than 10 minutes from where Megan Latimer had last been seen. Renwick and her team served a warrant on a gray morning when air smelled of clay. The house on Dundas appeared ordinary, its garden trimmed, curtains drawn, porch light off, though the sky still dimmed with rain. No one answered the doorbell. When entry teams breached, something moved deep inside, the scurry of a pet or echoes of an unlatched window. The house proved empty of people, yet unnervingly lived in. Inside, every room contained some vestige of routine. Cereal bowl left soaking, calendar squares filled in neat handwriting, power bills paid, yet no documents bore that of Lawrence Kerr. Instead, utility records under the name Peter Haynes. The alias was not new, merely his given name rearranged using middle initials and defunct postal boxes. It explained why searches under known identifiers had turned up nothing suspicious earlier. In the back bedroom, police found the heart of the operation. Black plastic sheeting lined the walls, taped at seams. Dozens of Polaroid photographs hung from thumbtacks, each depicting sections of coastal scrub, quarry stone faces, and tire impressions. The images were methodical. Some included scale markers, others exposure notes scrawled on reverse sides. 3 showed victims, faces, eyes closed, light filtered like portraits. Forensics later confirmed one subject as Megan Latimer, another as Kylie Naughton. The third remained unidentified. On the floor beneath the photographs sat an open wooden crate containing disposable cameras, rope fragments, and reel tapes labeled numerically. Most reels carried nothing but muffled natural sound, wind, insects, shifting sand, aside from one recording that captured faint breathing layered over rhythmic scraping, then silence. Renwick listened to it 3 times that night. Each cycle strengthened her conviction that the killer was recording not for memory, but for calibration. The deliberate spacing of noise and quiet, the identical durations, all hinted at obsessive ritual. A local bank statement discarded in the bin corresponded to an account receiving deposits from side contracts unrelated to Westrail. Investigators traced payments to a private landscaping business registered under Haynes's name, but unlisted publicly. Its invoices included work performed at new housing sites beyond Joondalup, clearing sand for retaining walls, excavation of fill loops. The coordinates roughly matched the quarries. When confronted at his workplace 2 days later, Haynes displayed mild annoyance rather than fear. He consented to questioning, repeating his innocence with slow precision. His solicitor arrived within an hour and halted interrogation. Without an immediate confession or DNA, detectives again had to release him, though surveillance was resumed. Renwick returned to the Dundas Street house, standing in drizzle, as technicians removed the last boxes. Police sealed the property, but allowed her to enter alone briefly to inspect an item she had requested preserved. It was a single map pinned near the doorway, drawn in red pencil. The outlines covered Perth's northern suburbs, annotated with numbers corresponding to quarries, power substations, and vacant lots. In the map's margin, one phrase appeared in tiny writing: "Third line complete." The discovery set off panic across command staff. A third line implied a third victim. Cross-referencing missing persons reports yielded a probable fit: Tracy Ryder, a 20-year-old cafe worker last seen leaving a coastal market near Trigg in late March. Her car was found abandoned near dunes that same week, brushed aside initially as a voluntary disappearance after a domestic dispute. Now, detectives reopened the file. Tracy resembled the same general profile: young, unattached, active at night hours, but this time, Renwick demanded excavation of the marked zones on the map's third line. At an abandoned industrial site north of Clarkson, cadaver dogs indicated decomposition beneath layers of compacted sand. Digging commenced through soft rain. The body's recovery confirmed the worst. Tracy's remains showed identical signs of restraint and suffocation found in earlier victims. Her discovery added weight the prosecution urgently needed. Haynes was arrested that evening at a petrol station, compliant, asking only whether the search had gone beyond the northern ring. The phrase entered every later report. The arrest ignited public fervor, even as Haynes maintained his bland calmness through transport and charge. The media labeled him the Sandman, an echo of something almost mythic. But Renwick knew myth had nothing to do with what she had seen in that house: the controlled isolation, the absence of rage or passion. But the Dundas house still hoarded one final secret. Buried under the floorboards of the sealed bedroom, forensic diggers found a shortwave receiver, its dials marked with chalk. One frequency band was circled repeatedly in red marker, accompanied by a note: "Broadcast begins only when silence holds." Technicians tuned into the frequency late that night. At precisely 3 a.m., static gave way to a faint hum, then a recorded male voice repeating numbers: 3 digits, pauses, 3 digits again. The loop continued for nearly 15 minutes before cutting out. The tape was filed away as potential evidence of derangement. Yet weeks later, similar transmissions appeared briefly along Western frequencies, sometimes caught by radio hobbyists who wrote letters claiming it sounded like someone counting trains in code. Police dismissed these claims as conspiracy, but Renwick logged each recurrence quietly. By September, court preparations commenced. Prosecutors collected everything: photographs, maps, rope fibers, the signature Polaroids. But even as evidence mounted, Renwick sensed the case was only half exposed. Haynes never asked about charges or bail. He requested instead that his plants in the Dundas garden be watered monthly until, quote, patterns returned. It was an odd phrase, meaningless to most, yet to her it suggested continuity. The third line might have been complete, but his map held space enough for more. That thought haunted Renwick into spring, when radio interference from distant storms carried faint bursts of the same coded rhythm her technicians once recorded: 3 digits, pause, 3 digits again. Only then did she begin to suspect that patterns were not metaphors but coordinates, and that someone else might still be listening. The conviction had come quickly, if not cleanly. Peter Haynes received 3 life sentences in early February, one for each confirmed victim. The evidence compiled from his house, vehicles, and the sandpit excavations was enough for the judge to call his acts an architecture of death. Despite the language, the court saga offered little satisfaction. There was no confession, no hint of motive. No answer for the coded transmissions that seemed to follow his arrest. Detective Inspector Claire Renwick attended every day of testimony, but left the courthouse under gray skies, feeling less closure than hollow delay. Haynes never looked to the gallery. He sat stiff, expression bland, gaze angled toward some point behind the witness box. When asked about the women, he said only that the coast hides what the city rejects, a sentence that convinced most psychiatrists of moral vacancy. To Renwick, it sounded rehearsed. After sentencing, the department stored hundreds of photographs and recordings in an archive downtown. Renwick hoped to step away from the case, but the signals would not vanish. Amateur radio enthusiasts across Western Australia began reporting shortwave bursts in the early morning, containing the same repeated patterns identified by the task force. Locations varied, yet the first traceable signal originated mere kilometers from the limestone corridor the victims had disappeared along. Each sequence contained 6 numbers divided by rhythmic pauses, always beginning with a 3. Technicians logged them but could not decode meaning. The broadcasts lasted only minutes, often drowned by static before abruptly ceasing. For weeks, Renwick tried to dismiss them as hoaxes, sparked by curiosity. Yet the tone of the public reports shifted when a miner working north of the city recognized one number string as matching the coordinate tag on an abandoned survey stake from an old quarry site. Police inspection of that coordinate, 31.548S, 115.736E, revealed another skeleton, badly decomposed, partially buried near an unregistered shaft. Dental analysis matched Aaron Selway, missing since 1995. The discovery divided investigators. Some saw it as proof Haynes had killed more than known victims. Others wondered if retrieval after his imprisonment pointed to an accomplice continuing the pattern. Renwick believed the second possibility. Each broadcast might be instruction, not confession. She revisited evidence logs, tracing any items unaccounted for since the Dundas Street search. Among them, 12 Polaroid films remained missing, listed as, quote, undocumented. A review of inventory slips showed they were stored on the night of his arrest and signed out days later under the name C. Brenton. No employee by that name existed. The signature's handwriting, when examined by analysts, bore resemblance not to Haynes but to his former site supervisor at West Rail Freight, Clive Brenton, who had resigned abruptly and moved to Karratha shortly before the arrest. Renwick traveled there with 2 officers in April. Karratha baked under desert sun, a planned grid of suburbia sparking against red earth and industrial tanks. Brenton worked at a fuel depot servicing mining trucks. When confronted, he admitted knowing Haynes but denied any knowledge of the missing films. He spoke little, eyes behind sunglasses, long pauses between sentences. A quick search of his home produced none of the evidence. What interested Renwick more was what, quietly, almost conversationally, he said when asked about the shortwave frequency. "It used to reach only 2 radios," he muttered. After the arrests, the silence deserved company again. The phrase followed her back to Perth. Forensics later found a set of transmissions emanating from near the Naval Communication Station north of the city, a heavily restricted area where civilian access was not possible. The military denied any unauthorized activity. Still, the timing lined perfectly with each report. Late that summer, another package arrived at the police mailroom. Inside lay a Polaroid photograph, printed on the same discontinued film used by Haynes, showing a patch of leveled earth beside a power substation. No date, no location noted, but embedded within the image border someone had handwritten the numbers 315,476, 115,744, another coordinate pair. Renwick recognized the pattern at once. When plotted, it pointed to a newly developed residential estate built on reclaimed sand near Joondalup. Excavations there unearthed only fragments of rope fibers and half-buried rags, no bodies. Still, fibers matched the signature gold polyester composite from the original murders. If someone sought to tell police where to dig, the implication was clear. Haynes's map had been incomplete, and someone else still tended the design. At Casuarina prison, where Haynes lived out his sentence, Renwick requested a final interview. The warden allowed 20 minutes. She expected refusal or silence. Instead, he answered each question softly, but without emotion. He denied sending messages, denied the existence of accomplices, and when asked about Brenton, looked down and smiled faintly. "I told you all. There were patterns in the quiet," he said. "What listens will learn the rules eventually." He lifted his hands, palms scarred from years of manual labor, and flexed the fingers as though testing a remembered rhythm. Above, the fluorescent light hummed in intermittent tones, its flickering breaking into 3 short bursts. 1 pause. 3 more. Renwick could not tell whether the reaction was coincidence or provocation. That evening she stood near the marina, watching fishing boats drift, thinking of the phrase, "Broadcast begins only when silence holds." Perhaps the transmissions were never coming from a radio tower at all. Perhaps they came from the mechanical hum built into any environment, the steady cycling of engines, cranes, flickering lamps, echoing patterns recorded years earlier near the sand pits. 2 months later, a maintenance crew digging to install telecommunications cabling just west of Joondalup struck an object embedded near compacted construction clay. It turned out to be a shortwave transmitter the size of a shoebox, battery corroded but wiring intact. The housing bore serial numbers filed off, but residue of Westrail freight adhesive, the same material found in Haynes's workshop. The signal logs, when downloaded, revealed timestamps initiating weeks after his incarceration. Someone else had indeed turned it back on. What haunted Renwick was the final file hidden in the device's memory. It contained a still frame from video, a pale rectangle showing the shoreline at dusk. In the foreground stood a woman, shot from behind, camera raised toward the horizon. Her posture echoed those earlier Polaroids pinned in Haynes's room, the image embedded metadata indicating it had been captured 3 weeks earlier. The photograph felt like a reply. It suggested continuation, ritual, inheritance. Renwick began to realize that what she chased was not one man's pathology, but a sequence, something handed quietly from one practitioner to another, each adopting the pattern like inheriting a language. The headlines that winter declared resolution anyway. Sandpit Killer Network dismantled. The public drifted back to normal concern, the case shelved within mounted binders labeled closed. Yet at night, when radio static rose and fell across her desk, Renwick sometimes tuned through interference until she heard, faint but deliberate, that familiar rhythm, 3 digits. Pause, 3 again. Each time she wrote down the numbers and pinned them beside the old map from Dundas Street, fearing what might happen once every point was finally connected. Autumn brought the dry winds back across Western Australia, scattering ochre dust through the suburbs, coating cars, fences, and lamp posts in a reminder of the desert beyond the city. Detective Inspector Claire Renwick had been reassigned to administrative duties by then, her superiors eager to put the sandpit murders behind them. Too many officers had spent too many nights chasing phantom signals, generating more rumors than leads. Officially, the case was closed. But still, the broadcasts came. Brief bursts before dawn. 3 digits, pause, 3 digits again, and always on the same shortwave frequency. The source moved subtly each time, like someone carrying the transmitter to successive points along the coast. Engineers logged them and found weak triangulations suggesting mobility by vehicle. When plotted over older coordinates, the pattern sketched a slow arc, bending south toward Fremantle. Renwick kept her office in quiet rebellion. Off-duty, she continued charting transmissions by hand, scoring each point on a layered transparency. Over months, the paths began resembling something like contour lines, narrowing around a single locus just above the Swan River's industrial belt. The more she studied it, the more it looked intentional, less a scatter than a spiral converging on the city's center. In late April, a maintenance worker clearing debris from beneath a disused railway bridge near Bayswater discovered a weatherproof box sealed under a film of clay. Inside lay another Polaroid, wrapped in clear plastic. The picture showed part of a concrete underpass, graffitied walls softened by rain stains, and a faint shape at the far edge, a figure crouched beside a shopping trolley. Handwritten along the photo's border, 469 Journey concludes. The numbers fit the rhythm of the old broadcasts. When plotted against Renwick's map, they intersected precisely across the area where the quarry corridor met the city rail line, the transitional zone connecting sand and steel. She understood at once what it implied. The geography of absence had shifted inward. Whoever continued Haynes's ritual was moving closer. On May 12th, she went there alone, carrying only a camera and a small shortwave receiver. The site had been earmarked for redevelopment, yet remained cordoned off behind rusted fences. Broken glass sparkled among weeds. She tuned the receiver as she walked. For minutes, nothing but static murmured. Then, somewhere near the tunnel's mouth, 3 digits cut through the noise, low and distinct. She followed the sound until it faded to silence, then stronger again from the opposite direction, as if curling around her. The sense of surveillance, familiar from every phase of the case, rose anew. A chill breeze brushed through the underpass. In the beam of her flashlight, she saw what looked like chalk marks along the interior walls. Lines, circles, numeric arrows resembling architectural notations, yet arranged into spirals descending toward the floor's center. At that center lay a shallow depression filled with dry sand, trucked in from somewhere else. Embedded in it were fragments of rope, and one rusted tag stamped WFS, the initials of Westrail Freight Services. The texture of the sand reminded her of those northern dunes 2 years earlier. It occurred to her the pattern might have come full circle, not only in ritual, but in physical relocation, transferring the void from coast to city. Renwick documented the scene, called for forensics, and returned home before sunrise. The next morning, when she brought colleagues to the site, everything had changed. The chalk markings and sandpit were gone, pavement scoured clean by water. Only a faint residue of calcium and sodium sulfates remained, consistent with industrial detergent. She thought at first the workers had erased evidence out of ignorance, but the city confirmed that no maintenance crew had been scheduled there overnight. By June, public interest had resurfaced. Tabloids ran pieces on the Second Sandman, mixing conspiracy with folklore. Anonymous calls flooded dispatch. One contained a recording of rhythmic digit sequences matching Renwick's documented chromatic intervals, but ending with the distinctive mechanical click, the sound of a Polaroid shutter. Forensics traced the call's point of origin to a payphone near Mitchell Freeway, an area under construction where a new highway bridge cut across landfill. When officers searched the site, they found beneath an overhang a fresh patch of filled earth marked by small metal stakes glinting red under halogen light. One stake bore the inscription 8B. Digging commenced under her supervision. Midnight air smelled of clay and motor oil as excavators scraped away the soil. Half a meter down, They uncovered a metal box containing a small cassette player, still ticking faintly. Inside the tape reel, pre-recorded broadcast hum, repeated three-digit codes lasting 6 minutes, then a human voice whispering barely above background. Observe the observer. It was the same rule that had surfaced years earlier in the northern quarries. But the accent was different. Younger. Female. Forensics later contradicted any suggestion of editing. It was live speaking, not dubbing. Whoever succeeded Haynes had adapted his words, continuing the lexicon. The following night, as rain moved through the city, a guard at the evidence facility reported a power flicker, followed by a faint pulse emitted from one of the confiscated transmitters in storage. The activation light flashed 3 times, pause, 3 again, then extinguished. Security logs showed no breach. Renwick visited the facility at dawn. She found the transmitter cool but inexplicably carrying a smear of fine wetland sand, damp and fragrant, with sea salt. It could only have come from recent exposure to the coast. Whoever had activated it must have taken it briefly, used it, returned it again, unnoticed, continuing the cycle under police watch. In her final report, never formally filed, Renwick wrote, "The pattern no longer belongs to a person. It belongs to a process. Each execution breeds another interpreter. The city itself hums to that frequency now. Every echo is a rehearsal." By the year's end, she retired early. Her health cited nominally as cause. Some colleagues hinted at breakdown. Others said exhaustion. She moved inland to a property near the wheat belt, away from the coast, away from wires and signals. For a time she managed peace. Then, one searing afternoon, the local postmaster received a parcel addressed only by coordinates. It contained a single Polaroid. The image showed rolling farmland under relentless sun. At its bottom edge, inset faintly against glare, a small impression of sand could be seen spiraling inward, like water draining away. Across the border, someone had written, "Fourth line complete." The photo arrived the same month that tremors disrupted communications across the western power grid, briefly knocking radio stations offline. When waves steadied again, technicians across 3 towns detected a new frequency emerging clean through static, 3 digits, followed by a whisper too soft to discern, as though an engine far beneath the soil had begun turning once more. That signal has never been traced. Today, more than 2 decades later, power line repair crews north of Perth still report intermittent bursts of tone on certain nights when the wind sweeps inland carrying dust from the buried quarries. They call it the geometry of silence, the hum blending with the ocean's low drone until it vanishes. Those who worked under Renwick remember her phrase about geography and absence. Few speak of it openly. But in police archives, sealed under reference file WFS 8B99, one final note typed by an unknown clerk rests atop the last envelope of photographs. Rule 4. When the pattern completes, begin again. Now let's get into the next story. The water along the southern edge of Lake Superior had begun to harden into plates of gray ice, thin at first, then thick enough to silence the small waves that usually lapped against the rocks below the bluff. In late January, the city of Marquette settled into its seasonal stillness, the kind that arrived not with peace but with endurance. Snow narrowed the streets. Wind scoured the hills. Even the old industrial structures near the harbor seemed to stand more rigidly, as if bracing themselves against something unseen. On the morning the case began, the temperature never rose above 0. A county plow cleared Glenwood Street just after dawn, its blades leaving behind long ridges of packed snow that hardened almost immediately. A sanitation worker noticed the car first. It sat angled slightly toward the curb, its front bumper pressed against a drift as if the driver had stopped without fully committing to the turn. The vehicle had not been ticketed. No one had reported it abandoned. Its presence felt wrong only in a vague way, the kind of wrongness that did not announce itself until someone slowed down and looked twice. The car was a late-model sedan registered to a small regional accounting firm. The windows were frosted from the inside. The engine was cold. There were no visible signs of damage, no broken glass, no marks in the snow suggesting a struggle. It looked, at a glance, like a vehicle left overnight by someone who had chosen to walk the rest of the way home. That impression dissolved once the driver's side door was opened. Inside, the seat was pushed farther back than average. The key was still in the ignition. The radio was off. A thin layer of ice coated the inside of the windshield, indicating the car had been sealed for some time. In the footwell, a leather briefcase rested upright, its clasp closed. On the passenger seat sat a pair of gloves folded carefully together, not dropped or forgotten, but placed. There was no sign of the driver. The name attached to the registration was Michael Carter, age 43. He lived less than 2 miles away, in a modest split-level house overlooking a wooded rise near Presque Isle. Carter was known in professional circles as reliable and precise, someone who arrived early and stayed late without complaint. He had 2 children, both teenagers, and a marriage that appeared unremarkable in every outward sense. There was no record of debt, no history of violence, no pattern of risk-taking behavior. He had been reported late to work only once in the previous decade, during a winter storm that shut down half the county. By mid-morning, the quiet anomaly of the car had become something heavier. Officers canvassed the surrounding blocks, their boots compressing the snow into darkened paths. Neighbors reported nothing unusual, no arguments, no unfamiliar vehicles, no sounds carried on the wind. The absence of detail began to define the case almost immediately, shaping it into a question that resisted easy framing. Michael Carter had not vanished into chaos. He appeared to have stepped out of an orderly life and simply failed to return. The search began close to the car and widened by degrees, following the logic of proximity before surrendering to uncertainty. Officers checked nearby alleys and the narrow stairways that cut between houses on the slope. Snow covered everything evenly, smoothing away the small signs that usually told stories in winter. Footprints softened by wind, impressions filled and erased overnight. The lack of disturbance around the vehicle suggested that whatever had happened did not involve panic. If Michael Carter had left the car on foot, he had done so calmly, with enough presence of mind to take his gloves and close the door behind him. At his house, the scene offered no contradiction. The driveway was empty. The porch light was off. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. His wallet sat in the kitchen drawer where he kept it, tucked behind old receipts. His phone lay on the nightstand, fully charged, untouched since the previous evening. A thin line of frost clung to the inside of the bedroom window, evidence that the heat had lowered overnight but not shut off entirely. It looked like a home left in the middle of a routine, not abandoned. Investigators reconstructed the last confirmed movements with care. Carter had left his office just before 6, carrying the same briefcase found in the car. A security camera at a nearby bank captured his vehicle passing through an intersection downtown, headlights steady, no abrupt turns or stops. After that, there was nothing. No traffic cameras on Glenwood Street. No witnesses who remembered seeing the sedan pull over. The timeline narrowed into a quiet corridor of minutes that could not be accounted for. The briefcase became a focal point. Inside were client files, neatly organized, and a small notebook filled with figures written in Carter's careful hand. There were no personal notes, no signs of agitation or distraction. The contents reflected someone thinking about work, about obligations extending into the future. It was difficult to reconcile that order with the idea of voluntary disappearance. It was equally difficult to imagine an abduction that left behind such an undisturbed scene. As the day wore on, the temperature dropped further, turning breath into a constant white plume. Search teams moved toward the wooded areas near Presque Isle, scanning the shoreline and the frozen paths that traced the bluff. They found nothing. The lake ice remained intact, unbroken except for the distant channels maintained by the harbor. There were no marks leading toward the water, no evidence that anyone had slipped or fallen. The natural explanations thinned quickly. Psychologically, the case resisted easy categorization. Carter did not fit the profile of someone seeking escape. His financial records showed no preparation for departure. His relationships, as far as could be determined, were stable, if subdued. Those who knew him described a man who favored predictability, who found comfort in routine. If there was strain beneath that surface, it had been well concealed. By evening, the city had begun to take notice. News of the abandoned car spread through local radio and social media, carried with a mix of concern and speculation. Yet the official facts remained spare. A man had driven home from work. He had stopped short of his destination. He had left his car in the cold. Everything else was inference. As night settled over Marquette, the street where the car had been found grew quiet again. Snow fell lightly, covering the impressions left by boots and tires, restoring the scene to a blankness that felt intentional. Somewhere within that silence lay the answer to where Michael Carter had gone, and why a life defined by careful order had broken off so abruptly, leaving behind only an empty seat and a set of questions that refused to align. The following morning brought no clarity, only the slow accumulation of procedure. A formal missing person report was filed, shifting the case from a roadside anomaly to an open investigation. Detectives from the county sheriff's department joined the effort, reviewing the initial findings with an attention sharpened by the absence of obvious direction. When a case offers no single point of pressure, every detail carries equal weight, and every assumption must be held loosely. Attention returned to the route Carter would have taken home. Glenwood Street was not a detour. It was a quiet connector between downtown and the hillside neighborhoods, used most often by locals who preferred to avoid the steeper grades. There was no reason for him to stop there unless something intervened. Investigators drove the stretch repeatedly, noting sightlines, pull-offs, and the way houses sat back from the road. Several properties had porches facing the street, but winter had driven most residents indoors early. Curtains were drawn, windows reflected only snow and sky. Vehicle forensics yielded little. There were no fingerprints out of place, no foreign fibers on the seats. The fuel tank was nearly half full. The tires showed no damage, no indication of a mechanical failure that might have forced an unscheduled stop. Even the heater controls were set as usual, adjusted just enough to keep the cabin warm without fogging the glass. It was a portrait of normalcy frozen in time. The question of intent hovered quietly over each finding. If Carter had stepped out of the car willingly, someone or something had prompted that choice within a narrow window. A medical episode was considered and set aside. There was no history of heart issues, no medication left behind at home that suggested a sudden crisis. Exposure was unlikely given the proximity to residences and the lack of any trace leading away from the road. Each explanation failed not dramatically but incrementally, eroding confidence rather than collapsing outright. Interviews with colleagues added texture but no answers. The days leading up to his disappearance had followed their usual rhythm. He had attended meetings, completed filings, spoken about upcoming deadlines. One coworker mentioned that he had seemed distracted late in the week, But distraction was common during tax season and did not carry the weight of alarm. No one recalled an argument or an unusual phone call. There were no hints of conflict that could be traced forward. At home, his family moved through the first stages of disbelief. The house filled briefly with relatives and neighbors, then emptied again, settling into a quiet that felt provisional. His children stayed home from school, their routine suspended. His wife retraced the previous evening repeatedly, searching for missed signals, replaying small moments that now felt burdened with meaning. Investigators noted her composure without interpreting it, aware that shock often presented as control rather than collapse. By the third day, the case had acquired a shape defined by what it was not. There was no body, there was no crime scene, there was no clear motive for disappearance. The landscape itself seemed to resist intrusion, its winter stillness absorbing effort without response. Each search ended the same way, with teams returning empty-handed, their findings summarized in brief reports that added little beyond confirmation of absence. What remained was the car, still parked on Glenwood Street, now cordoned off and half buried again by fresh snow. It stood as a fixed point in a story that refused to move forward, a reminder that whatever had happened to Michael Carter had occurred quickly, quietly, and without witnesses. The investigation pressed on, but beneath the procedural momentum lay an unease that had begun to take hold. The case did not feel dormant. It felt paused, as if waiting for a single piece of information capable of shifting everything that had been assumed so far. The pause broke not with discovery, but with contradiction. On the fourth day, a patrol officer reviewing routine traffic footage from an unrelated incident noticed a sedan that matched Carter's vehicle traveling east along a service road near the rail yards. Several hours after his car was believed to have been abandoned, the image quality was poor, softened by falling snow and distance, but the timing alone was enough to unsettle the working timeline. The footage did not capture a license plate or a driver's face. It showed only a familiar silhouette moving through a place it should not have been. Investigators returned to the assumption that the car had remained stationary all night and found that it rested on inference rather than proof. The frost inside the windshield suggested prolonged closure, but not a precise duration. The sanitation workers' report placed the car on Glenwood Street at dawn, not before. Between 6 in the evening and that moment lay a span of hours that had been treated as static simply because nothing had been seen to move. The possibility that the vehicle had been relocated, even briefly, forced a re-examination of intent. If Carter had driven elsewhere after leaving downtown, the choice of Glenwood Street as a final stopping point became less random. It could represent a return rather than a departure, an attempt to resume the ordinary route home after an interruption that had not gone as planned. The car, once read as an endpoint, began to look more like a marker left behind. That shift brought renewed scrutiny to the notebook found in the briefcase. Previously dismissed as routine, its last few pages were now reviewed line by line. Among the columns of figures was a repeated notation, a sequence of numbers that did not align with any client file. They appeared again and again, written carefully, then crossed out, then written once more. It was not encryption in any formal sense, but it suggested preoccupation. Someone had been thinking about those numbers long enough to return to them. Financial analysts from the department examined Carter's professional work for irregularities. They found none that suggested fraud or coercion, but they did note a pattern of late evening access to certain accounts, activity that fell outside normal office hours. The transactions were legitimate, yet their timing hinted at something conducted privately, without oversight. It raised the possibility that Carter had been involved in a matter he did not share, not out of malice, but perhaps caution. As these threads emerged, the emotional temperature of the investigation changed. The early days had been defined by restraint. by the careful avoidance of assumptions. Now, a sense of proximity crept in, the feeling that the case was no longer diffuse but coiling inward. Each new detail did not expand the field so much as tighten it, narrowing the space in which answers could exist. Late that evening, a call came in from a resident near the rail yards, reporting an unfamiliar object partially exposed by drifting snow behind an abandoned storage building. It was not described as evidence, only as something that did not belong. Officers were dispatched with measured urgency, aware that expectation could distort perception as easily as haste. They arrived to find a dark shape against the white ground, too large to ignore, too incomplete to define from a distance. Whatever it was, it suggested movement after the moment the car had been left on Glenwood Street. It suggested that the stillness surrounding Michael Carter's disappearance had been misleading, that beneath it lay a sequence of actions not yet understood. As floodlights cut through the snow and illuminated the edge of the object, the investigation crossed an unseen threshold. The case was no longer waiting. It had begun at last to answer back. The object behind the storage building was a section of carpet, stiff with ice and partially buried, where the snow had drifted against the cinder block wall. It was not remarkable in isolation, a remnant of discarded renovation perhaps, but its placement was deliberate. One edge had been folded inward, as if to conceal what lay beneath. When officers pulled it back, they found blood frozen into the gravel, darkened to the color of rust. The amount was limited but unmistakable. It marked the first moment the case crossed from ambiguity into violence. The location sat less than a mile from where the sedan had been captured on traffic footage. It was accessible by a network of service roads, rarely used at night, poorly lit and shielded from nearby residential streets. Tire impressions nearby were degraded by snow, but enough remained to suggest a vehicle had stopped briefly and then left. There was no sign of a prolonged struggle. Whatever had happened there had been efficient. Forensic analysis of the blood confirmed it belonged to Michael Carter. There was no indication of a fatal wound at the site, only injury. That distinction mattered. It meant he had survived long enough to be moved. The investigation shifted fully toward homicide, not because a body had been found, but because the sequence of events now required intent and control. Accidents did not leave scenes like this behind abandoned buildings. The numbers in Carter's notebook were identified 2 days later. They corresponded to internal transfer codes used by a regional investment cooperative that Carter's firm audited annually. On their own, the codes were meaningless. In sequence, they pointed to a pattern of fund movement routed through a shell account created years earlier and never closed. The sums were modest individually, small enough to evade notice, but consistent. Someone had been siphoning money slowly, patiently, trusting that familiarity would dull scrutiny. Carter had noticed. The late-night account access, the repeated notations, and the careful crossing out all suggested verification rather than participation. He had not reported it yet. Investigators believed he was still confirming his conclusion, aware of the professional and personal consequences of being wrong. That caution likely cost him time he did not have. The shell account traced back to a logistics company operating out of the rail corridor. On paper, it handled freight coordination. In practice, it functioned as a laundering mechanism for several small-scale financial crimes that relied on invisibility rather than scale. One of its silent partners was a former client of Carter's firm, a man who had known him for over a decade and understood his habits, his roots, and his restraint. Surveillance records placed that man near Glenwood Street on the night Carter disappeared. Phone data showed brief proximity between their devices, followed by a shared movement toward the service road by the rail yards. Investigators concluded that Carter had been persuaded to stop, likely by someone he trusted. likely under the assumption that the conversation would be brief and contained. The folded gloves on the passenger seat supported that assessment. He had expected to return. What followed was not planned as murder. The injury at the storage building was consistent with a sudden escalation, a single blow delivered during an argument that slipped out of control. Panic replaced calculation. Carter was transported away from the site while still alive, his fate sealed not by premeditation but by fear of exposure. His body was recovered weeks later from a disused freight car on an inactive spur line, concealed and left to the cold. The man responsible was arrested without incident. He confessed not out of remorse but exhaustion, confronted with evidence that left no remaining space for denial. The explanation he offered aligned with the facts but added nothing to them. By the time the case closed, the mechanics were clear. Michael Carter had not vanished. He had uncovered something small and persistent, and underestimated how far someone else would go to keep it buried. The sedan on Glenwood Street had not marked the end of his day, only the moment when routine gave way to consequence.